What did Semen Semenov see over the Siberian forest in 1908 that made him believe his own shirt had caught fire? He was sitting on the porch of a trading post roughly 40 miles from a patch of empty taiga that had so far nothing remarkable about it at all. 40 miles, and it was not nearly far enough. He was one of the closest surviving witnesses, and the strangest part of this is not what reached him out there. It is what was found at the source. Roughly 80 million trees went down across 830 square miles of Siberian taiga, and not one of them fell randomly. Every trunk lay pointing outward, away from one exact spot, like iron filings around a magnet. From the air, the pattern looks like a butterfly with its wings spread. Whatever did this released all of its energy at a single point in space, and the forest recorded the direction of that point with the precision of a scientific instrument. So follow the arrows inward to the middle. That is exactly where it stops making sense. Here is what should be sitting at the middle of a pattern like that. Drive to northern Arizona and look at Meteor Crater, a hole about 3/4 of a mile across and hundreds of feet deep, punched out roughly 50,000 years ago by an iron meteorite estimated at around 50 meters wide. 50 meters, same ballpark as the Tunguska object, possibly smaller. Arizona got a wound you can see from orbit. So somewhere out in that Siberian swamp there should be a hole of the same order. Hold that thought, everything in this story turns on it. And there is a second thing you would expect to find. A stony body that size should have scattered debris for miles, chunks in the soil, fragments in the peat, something a person could pick up and hold. Teams would spend decades looking for exactly that, digging, drilling, sifting, and dragging the bogs, and what they carried back out is the reason this event still has an argument attached to it a century later. The Evenki reindeer herders who lived in that country had their own explanation and their own response. Many of them refused to go back in, treating the burned zone as ground that had been claimed by something. When the first Soviet scientist finally arrived, he struggled to hire anyone willing to walk him to the center. A vacuum like that pulls in theories, and Tunguska has collected some spectacular ones. In 1946, the Soviet writer Alexander Kazantsev published a story arguing the blast was a nuclear-powered alien ship that failed on approach, and a chunk of the reading public simply took it as fact. In 1973, two physicists went further in the journal Nature. A small black hole, they proposed, had passed clean through the planet. Antimatter, natural gas eruptions, a stray piece of comet. All of it has been on the table. And every one of those theories exists to solve the same stubborn problem. Go back to the morning itself. Tuesday, the 30th of June, 1908, just after 7 o'clock local time, over the Podkamenaya Tunguska River in central Siberia. This is one of the emptiest places on the planet. Swamp, larch, mosquito clouds, a few scattered Evenki families moving with their reindeer. The closest thing to a town was a trading post called Vanavara, roughly 40 miles from what would become the center. No cameras, no telegraph, no scientists, almost no witnesses. The largest impact event in recorded human history picked the one square of the map where nobody was watching. Except somebody was. A farmer named Semen Semenov was sitting on the porch of that trading post when, in his own words, the sky split in two and fire appeared high and wide above the forest. The heat became so unbearable he thought his shirt had caught fire and wanted to tear it off his back. Then the sky shut closed, a thump came like artillery, and the blast picked him up and threw him off his own porch. Now remember where he was standing. 65 kilometers from the center, 40 miles away, and he was still clawing at his shirt. Closer in, the accounts get harder to listen to. Evenki families describe being lifted into the air inside their own tents, waking up thrown into the trees, deaf for days afterwards. Reindeer herds burned where they stood. One herder was said to have lost around 1,500 animals, along with his storehouses and everything inside them. Fires took whatever was left. And then there is the number that never fits. In a blast that flattened a metropolitan area of forest, the reported human death toll sits in the low single digits. Not because it was gentle, because there was nobody there. The planet registered every bit of it. Seismographs in Irkutsk, hundreds of miles to the south, recorded the shock as though it were an earthquake. The pressure wave in the air spread outward, wrapped all the way around the Earth, and was picked up by barometers in Britain on its way past, and again coming back around. Windows broke hundreds of miles from the center. On the Trans-Siberian Railway, an engineer reportedly stopped his train, convinced the carriages were about to leave the rails. Every instrument agreed, enormous explosion, Siberia, this morning. And nobody could go and look. Then came the nights. For roughly 3 nights afterwards, the sky over Europe and Western Russia refused to go dark. In Sweden and Scotland, people photographed the landscape at midnight. At Greenwich and at Armagh Observatory in Northern Ireland, observers wrote in their logbooks about a glow bright enough to read newsprint by, with no moon in the sky to explain it. Think about that. Thousands of miles from Siberia, half a continent stood outside after midnight, staring at a sky that was quietly, obviously wrong, and not one of them knew what they were looking at. The answer was 19 years away. Why 19 years? Between 1908 and the late 1920s, Russia went through a world war, a revolution, and a civil war, and Tunguska was a rumor in the least accessible forest in the northern hemisphere. The man who finally went in was Leonid Kulik, a mineralogist at the Russian Academy of Sciences, a meteorite specialist, and by every account completely obsessed. He tried in 1921 and never reached the site. He spent years arguing that a giant iron meteorite was lying out there, a scientific prize, and, as he pitched it to officials, industrial-grade metal for the taking. Eventually the funding came through. In 1927, he got in. Sledges, horses, river crossings, then on foot through swamp and deadfall in a country where the mosquitoes are their own weather system. He had to talk local Evenki into guiding him, and several would only take him partway before turning back. Then he climbed a ridge and got his first look at the thing he had come thousands of miles to see. Trees down to the horizon in every direction, not blown into a chaotic mess combed flat. Aligned. Mile after mile, a forest laid over like grass under a hand. Kulik wrote that he could not fully take it in. Every fallen tree is an arrow, and every arrow points home, so he followed the trunks inward. He walked those arrows in, waiting for the ground to start rising into a rim, waiting for broken rock, waiting for the hole. Instead, the closer he got to the center, the stranger the forest became. The tree fall thinned out. Then it stopped altogether. And Leonid Kulik walked into the exact center of the largest explosion in recorded history and found himself standing in a forest that was, in the most unsettling way possible, still standing. They called them telegraph poles. At ground zero, the trees were upright bare trunks with every branch torn off, bark scorched black, dead but vertical, standing across several square miles like a field of blackened posts. Underneath them, no crater. Kulik found round, boggy depressions and convinced himself for a while that they were impact pits. They were permafrost bog. He kept coming back through the late 20s and the 30s. At one point, he had pumps brought in and drained an entire swamp looking for the buried meteorite. At the bottom of that hole, he found the stump of an old tree. In 1938, he arranged an aerial photographic survey of the central zone, which finally mapped that butterfly of destruction from above. That is roughly where his story ends. When Germany invaded, Kulik, by then in his late 50s volunteered for the militia, was captured and died of typhus in a prisoner of war camp in 1942. He never found his meteorite. There is now an asteroid named after him, and a crater on the moon that carries his name. The man who spent his life hunting a crater that did not exist finally got one, posthumously, on another world. So what actually happened up there? Take a rock somewhere between 40 and 60 meters across and throw it into the atmosphere at something like 15 kilometers per second. At that speed, air stops behaving like air. The pressure loading the front face climbs into the range that shatters stone. The body flattens, spreads out, breaks apart, and each fragment generates its own shockwave, which accelerates the breakup of the next one. A chain reaction, and it runs to completion in under a second. Everything the object had been carrying since the solar system was young converts into heat and blast, about 8 kilometers above the trees. That geometry is the whole answer. Directly beneath the burst, the blast wave arrives straight down. It pushes trees vertically into the ground, strips off every branch, and leaves the trunk standing. Kulik's telegraph poles were not survivors. They were the fingerprint of an explosion detonating directly overhead. Move outward, and the same wave arrives at an angle, gets a lever on each tree, and lays it flat, pointing away. There is your butterfly. Every impossible detail in that forest, the intact center, the radial fall, the missing hole, comes from one fact: nothing ever touched the ground. If that sounds like a convenient story invented to cover a missing rock, remember that we got to watch it happen live. On the 15th of February 2013, an object roughly 20 meters wide came in over Chelyabinsk, Russia, and detonated high in the atmosphere with an energy of about half a megaton. Hundreds of dashcams caught it. The main body never reached the ground. The blast wave did it blew in windows across the city and injured around 1,500 people, almost all of them cut by their own glass, and that rock was about a third the width of Tunguska's. Now scale it up. Airburst is the answer scientists are confident about. It is not the end of the argument. There is still no undisputed piece of the Tunguska object in anyone's collection, which means no settled answer on whether it was a stony asteroid or a fragment of a comet, possibly connected to Comet Encke, a theory that fits those glowing European nights but struggles elsewhere. And in 2007, an Italian team argued that Lake Checco, a funnel-shaped lake about 8 kilometers from ground zero, is a crater gouged by a surviving chunk. Sediment cores suggest the lake is older than 1908. That fight has never closed. Here is the part that should stay with you. The Tunguska object was small enough that, arriving out of a bright morning sky, nobody on Earth saw it coming. We are better at this now, and nowhere near solved. Look at asteroid 2024 YR4, a rock between roughly 50 and 67 meters across, Tunguska class, almost exactly. Its odds of striking Earth in December 2032 climbed past 3% before being ruled out in early 2025. Then its odds of hitting the moon climbed above 4% by mid-2025 and were only ruled out this past March after the Webb telescope tracked it again. NASA's dedicated asteroid hunter, NEO Surveyor, does not launch until late 2027. Which brings us back to those trees. Kulik spent more than a decade digging for a crater while standing inside the proof that there was never going to be one. And Siberia only received that proof because of timing. The planet turns. A few hours either way, and that same blast lands over a city instead of a swamp. In 1908, the sky over Europe glowed for 3 nights, and nobody understood why the warning did arrive, and it took 19 years and a man on foot to read it. That is the part that has to change. Not whether we can explain the next one afterwards, but how many hours we get before it. So how much warning do you think we get? Thanks for sticking through to the end. Your support means the world. Like, share, subscribe, 3 quick taps.